Where's my second belt? I've already got this one. Where's the second one at? Cheap. 4.2 billion this company was sold for.
The UFC is littered with huge moments by legendary superstars. But today, it feels different. Why is that? Fighters like George St-Pierre, Amanda Nunes, and Anderson Silva weren't just champions. They were untouchable. What happened to the fighters that could make an entire generation and look like they were better off as line cooks? And more importantly, is the UFC ever going to feel the same again without them? 5, 10, and 15 years ago, we had legends. Fighters who didn't just win, fighters who dominated. They gave us some of the greatest performances in UFC history, many of which we still talk about today. But right now, as you sit there and watch this video, the UFC is desperately searching for a new identity. The next wave of superstars is struggling to take over and the fans are starting to feel it. So what happened? Where did everybody go? And more importantly, why haven't the new stars taken the place of the old guard? Sure, we have dominant fighters today. Ilia Topuria just ran through Alexander Volkanovski. Duplessis just took out Adesanya pretty easily. But ask yourself, do these new guys feel the same as the old guard? I don't think so. Let's start with Amanda Nunes. When you look at the women's bantamweight division since she left, it's a ghost town. One of the best fights of last year, 2024, happened in PFL. Think about that. For UFC fans, that's a tough pill to swallow. That's coming off the heels of watching Amanda Nunes dominate the UFC, winning 11 out of her last 12 title fights. I mean, she put on banger after banger for years. After all, she is the GOAT of women's MMA, according to basically everybody. Nunes' 12-fight win streak, most of them being title fights, is something that another women's MMA fighter hasn't even sniffed. Of course, there's one legitimate blemish on her resume. She had a few losses on her resume here and there, but none after figuring it out, becoming who we knew her to be. That is until December 11th, 2021, at UFC 269, where she was submitted by Juliana Pena. Her 12-fight win streak came to an end that night, in a fight where she was a minus 1125 favorite, which is, by the way, the largest margin she was ever favored by in any fight in her entire career, beginning to end. And frankly, nobody expected her to lose. I think that you would have a hard time finding anyone on the internet who predicted Juliana Pena to win that night. But she did. Just a quick side note, that upset was the second largest in UFC history, behind only George St-Pierre losing to Matt Serra, and it made Amanda Nunes the 6th most favored title incumbent in UFC history. For perspective, let's talk about another great champion, Jon Jones. I'm sure you've heard of him. When he fought Chael Sonnen on short notice, he was less favored to win than Amanda Nunes was against Juliana Pena. And we all know how big of a mismatch that was. Jon Jones, being the winningest fighter in his whole era, going up against Chael Sonnen, a guy who wasn't in his weight class, literally or metaphorically, was less favored to win than Amanda Nunes was that night. That's how dominant she was. Then, in the blink of an eye, it was all over. Nunes, the UFC's first female two-division champion, had been dethroned. Nunes had spent the last few years fraud-checking all of women's MMA, year after year, until the law of averages hit her. She got caught. Of course, she came back, regained her title, and defended it one last time before riding off into the sunset. Whether she ever returns is anyone's guess. But for now, she's another legend, lost to time. It's not just the women's division that's experienced a shift. Let's look at one of the most iconic figures in UFC history, Anderson the Spider Silva. Silva was the one who changed everything for the middleweight division, leaving a legacy that looms large today. Anderson Silva nowadays may be better known for losing to Jake Paul in a rigged boxing match, but he was a flag bearer for greatness in mixed martial arts in the 2000s. He helped bring the UFC to heights it had never seen. Silva entered the UFC at 17-2, a record that wouldn't be absurd today, with the likes of Shavkat Rakhmonov boasting a record of 19-0 with 18 finishes, and Ilia Topuria with a record of 16-0 with 14 finishes. Hell, even Mick Barkin, who as of the making of this video, is 10-0 with 7 finishes. After taking out Chris Lieben in his debut, Silva didn't look back, winning the title off 22-1 Rich Franklin in his next fight, and then defending it 10 consecutive times. Really 11. I'm looking at you, Travis Letter. Not only did he defend the belt 10 times, but he got so bored at making everybody look stupid at 185 that he'd pop up to 205 to remind them that nobody in the world could shadowbox his reflection, much less the real thing. So, now you know about Silva's record, but let's pull back the curtain a little bit on what he was actually doing to these grown men. Spoiler alert, whatever he wanted. Have you ever heard the term that the best defense is a good offense? Me too, but Anderson Silva didn't think so. His significant strike defense of 59% places him 5th among UFC fighters all time with a minimum of 1,000 significant strikes attempted. That wasn't it for Silva though, and you know that. He had one of the most potent offensive arsenals of anyone in MMA history. He didn't just win, he destroyed. During his 16-fight UFC win streak, 14 of those came by finish, 10 in the first or second round. For perspective, let's talk about another legendary finishing streak. Tom Aspinall is on one right now. Tom has 5 UFC wins with 5 finishes, 4 of which are in the first round. That's an incredible streak, but Silva had almost 3 times as many finishes with a larger sample size, and many of them came just as fast, if not faster. Silva wasn't just playing the game. He was making his opponents take their chips and run home. Anderson wasn't alone in building that foundation, though. Across the pond, George St-Pierre was crafting his own era of dominance in the welterweight division. The two legends may have never crossed paths to satisfy what felt like their destinies, but their impacts on the sport were much the same. St-Pierre was a dominant champion with exception of a few fights, the first fight of which was in his first title fight, which is represented by a loss by first-round submission to Matt Hughes at UFC 50. After this fight, GSP ran off 5 straight victories, on his way back to UFC glory, finally capturing an opportunity to get his revenge on Matt Hughes at UFC 65, 2 years after their first meeting. So, all's well for the St. Isidore sensation, right? Not really. 5 months after winning his title, GSP stepped back in the cage to defend it against Matt Serra as the 4th largest betting favorite in UFC title fight history, and he lost. The good news is, though, the best was yet to come. GSP went on a redemption tour, beating Josh Koscheck in August of that year and winning the interim welterweight title against Matt Hughes, once again, and completing the trilogy. In December of that same year, finally, 1 year and 12 days removed from the most embarrassing moment of his MMA career, he got his revenge on Matt Serra and never looked back. St-Pierre went on to rack up 9 consecutive title wins, and 10 if you count him going into the Serra fight as the interim champ. I want to give you some perspective on what George St-Pierre did in those fights. He went 13-0 with a combined record of 219-47. Out of those 13 fights, 3 were finishes and the other 10 were decisions. In those decisions, his combined point total against his opponents was a plus 103. That's insane. He didn't just win rounds, he dominated. In fact, he actually won more rounds by 10-8 than he lost rounds in that stretch. We're talking about a level of consistency and dominance that we haven't seen since and might never see again. And then when you thought you'd seen it all for a global superstar, welcome Conor McGregor. A fighter who didn't necessarily dominate his division to the same degree that St-Pierre did, but who ushered in a new era of the UFC. McGregor, with his combination of charisma, skill, and drive to redefine what was possible inside the UFC, did just that. He didn't just change the landscape of MMA. He completely redefined it. He was the international superstar, and he brought the sport to a mainstream audience like never before, ushering in the casual fan. Before McGregor, MMA was a very niche sport. If you could handpick a fighter to make MMA mainstream, it was the one, the only, the notorious Conor McGregor. He single-handedly put the sport on the map and made it, along with himself, a global phenomenon. Prior to Mystic Mac, nobody could put on a show inside and outside the octagon to the level that was required to bring a casual fan onto their couch on a Saturday night to buy a pay-per-view, much less into the arena. And he did just that. He delivered inside the cage. His UFC career began with a bang, knocking out Marcus Bermage in his debut, and then he went on a killing spree. He took out, and let me know if you recognize any of these names, Max Holloway, Diego Brandao, Dustin Poirier, and Dennis Siver. Oh, and his fight against Chad Mendes for the interim featherweight title? Yeah, another explosive finish. He put him away with 3 seconds left in the second round. And just when you thought you'd seen it all, McGregor did the impossible. He walked into the cage, fearless, against one of the longest standing champions in all of mixed martial arts, Jose Aldo, and put him to sleep in 13 seconds. The McGregor era had officially begun, and he was on top of the world. But here's the thing, once McGregor reached the top of the mountain, he didn't look back. After winning the lightweight title against Eddie Alvarez and becoming the first fighter in the UFC to hold 2 belts simultaneously, after being the first fighter in Cage Warriors history to hold 2 belts simultaneously, McGregor reached his apex, and then his downfall started. Instead of chasing more glory in the UFC or putting himself in untouchable status by chasing a 3rd belt, he shifted focus. The allure of boxing Floyd Mayweather for a massive payday was too much for Conor to resist. He was set for life, and MMA became secondary. Since that fight, McGregor has only managed 1 win in the octagon, a relatively quick victory over Donald Cerrone at UFC 246, but then the losses started piling up. First to Khabib, and then 2 brutal defeats to Dustin Poirier. So what happened? I mean, it's obvious that McGregor lost his drive, but why? Did he get distracted by the fame, the fortune, and the life outside the cage? I say yes, and that's where the problem lies. McGregor's story is the first glimpse of what's to come. The rise of the modern superstar. Fighters who make so much money so quickly that they lose all hunger in the sport. McGregor didn't just fight in the UFC, he built a brand, created an empire, and in doing so, began what we see now. Fighters who make millions and don't fight as much. He was the first athlete to do it, and he was the first fighter to fully demonstrate the power of wealth and fame in MMA. And he set the tone for what I will now call the Inactivity Era. The Inactivity Era is upon us, and it's defined by fighters who have the tools to dominate, but for various reasons spend more time outside the cage than in it. Jon Jones is a perfect example of this. A fighter who spanned both generations and has represented both types of fighters throughout the course of his UFC career. Jones has been at the top of the sport for over a decade, but has only fought twice since his controversial win over Dominic Reyes in 2020. Worse yet, Jones and fighters like him are being rewarded for their inactivity. Jones got an immediate title shot after 3 years away from the sport, and then a fight against a 43-year-old Stipe Miocic, a matchup that felt more like a passing of the torch than a real contest for the real title. Meanwhile, Daniel Cormier has to sit and analyze head kicks that he received in a fight that officially didn't happen due to Jon Jones testing positive for PEDs. This isn't just about Jones, though. The trend is bigger than one fighter. It's about an entire shift in the sports culture. Fighters who rack up accomplishments early, make insane amounts of money, and then sit on the sidelines because they've already made their fortune. McGregor, as we just discussed, was the trailblazer, but now we see fighters like Khabib Nurmagomedov, who retired early with so much left to give the sport. And Islam, a fighter who could change this narrative, but may be primed to follow Khabib's blueprint in the coming years, despite being only in his early 30s and being as dominant as ever. And let's not forget Henry Cejudo, who climbed the top of the mountain twice, only to vacate 2 titles after a few wins because he didn't feel like the sport was exciting to him anymore. This era isn't necessarily about a lack of talent. It's about fighters who are more focused on other ventures, who have already been financially secured for the rest of their lives, and who see MMA as a stepping stone to something greater. The UFC now faces a strange paradox. A generation of fighters who are more talented than ever and less motivated than ever. But that doesn't have to mean we're finished, though. Fighters of today have a chance to take over and be active again, bringing the UFC from a washed-out version of itself back into full color. Fighters just like the aforementioned Islam Makhachev, just like Charles Oliveira, and just like Ilia Topuria. These fighters have the mentality and the drive to usher back in an era of activity at the top of the divisions of the UFC. These are the fighters who could redefine the UFC's future. It needs its next generation of fighters who are just as hungry for legacy as they are money. Fighters who want to be in the cage, not just staying warm in the spotlight. They may just be the ones who break the trend of inactivity and push the sport back to a place where the fights are happening regularly and stars are building legacies, one dominant win at a time. And that's a wrap on today's video. The UFC might be changing, but there's always hope on the horizon, and who knows what's next. All we can do is sit back and watch. I hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next one. Leave a comment down below. Who do you think is up next? Let's talk about it. Until next time, Keep the door open and the fridge stocked, because we're always breaking down the next chapter in UFC history.